last week in that recorded lesson, I was talking about community structure. We essentially went through together but separate, right? Different attributes of community structure. Does anyone remember any of those attributes, any of those features that we can quantify, that we can talk about in terms of community?
Thinking about like the horizontal.
So the community, of course, has vertical and horizontal niches, but what can we measure about the community itself? So like if we're comparing two communities, we can compare this of each one.
How many members there are in each community?
Yeah. So how many different types of species, right? So species abundance, purely number of species. So we've seen this graph before. This is an environmental gradient. And so if we were to take a measurement, take a sample right here along this gradient, we would see that there are two different species, right? So that was the species abundance, right? If we were to measure right here, we would see that there are 4 different species, right? So purely the number of species, the abundance. Anything else we can measure? Yeah.
The amount of resources.
Okay, yeah, so the amount of resources, we can measure things like, biomass, we can measure things like, the number of primary producers, the number of plants in an area, okay? Within each species, right, along those lines, we can measure the relative abundance, right? So in this particular community is essentially 50-50, these two different species, right? We kind of expand that out a little bit. We can talk about species diversity, right? So I gave you a couple different metrics, a couple different ways that we can express species diversity. This is not something you'll have to calculate on the final, but you should be kind of familiar with the concept. Species diversity takes into account both the pure number of species, or the abundance, there are 2 species versus 4 species, but also how even those species are, right? So this community here does not have a lot of evenness, right? There are mostly this hypothetical species and very few of these hypothetical species, right? If there was more evenness, there would be 25% of each of them. Okay? So species diversity actually reflects both abundance as well as evenness. And then I started to talk a little bit about food webs. We can actually calculate the connectance, how many different connections there are between the different trophic levels within a community. Okay, so just different ways of expressing what is happening within an entire community. And of course, that Cottonwood video expanded that out to a lot more metrics that can be used in the field. Okay. Until now, we've been talking about community structure over space. Right? We know at this point that as you ascend in altitude, like in Arizona, like Eric talked about earlier this semester, you essentially see the communities shift from one distinct community to the next. Okay? So over space. We also know that as you get farther from a water source, right, in this case, maybe this is the marsh. And so as you get farther from a water source, the physical characteristics are going to change, right? There's going to be different amounts of stress, right? Different amounts of water, oxygen, nutrients, et cetera, within the soil. And so we get these distinct communities along a gradient, an environmental gradient. What is this concept called again?
Oh wait, I was just about to say that zonation first.
Yes, perfect, love it.
And I was thinking of that exact example in my head right before the image came up there.
Yes, you guys are so good at predicting what I'm going to say. I don't know if that means I'm too predictable or if you guys are just not smart.
That's just kind of my jam.
Okay, that is your jam.
No, it means that you know as professor that you already know what we like.
Right. So I think we have a pretty good concept at this point of how communities change over space or over environmental gradients. I think we can also appreciate at this point that as environmental conditions change, right, communities are going to change accordingly. And of course, we just spent quite a long time talking about how species work together or they oppose each other, right? Either there's no winners one winner or two winners, right? Lots of different species interactions can further affect where species are going to be distributed and therefore community composition, right? Notice that this is the realized niche, not the fundamental niche. Today, our focus is going to be community structure changing through time. And so even if we keep on measuring the same place over and over again, the community is not going to be the same. Okay? And so this concept is called succession. This is a temporal change in the community at the same location. And so just as kind of proof of concept here, some scientists took a concrete block, right, and they put it in the water off the coast of California and essentially watched what happened. Okay? So they noticed what species and their abundance kind of colonized this brand new surface over time. So the same exact surface, the same block, but what they saw was that different species colonized at different times. Okay, so we've been looking at graphs with an environmental gradient along the x-axis. Now the x-axis contains a timeline. Okay, so the beginning of the experiment, the block was just put into place, and the end of their measurements. So what you can see here, without really focusing on the species themselves, we can see that some species colonize right away, and they're very abundant. There is no competition here. They have a completely new surface in which to colonize. Okay? Soon, other species can start to take hold, and essentially this is going to increase the competition between the initial colonizers or pioneers and these newly colonizing species. Okay? As competition gets more and more intense, and as more and more species take hold onto this block, the initial species are essentially outcompeted as others become more abundant. Okay? So even though we are looking at the same exact structure, the community is not the same from one September to the next September. Okay? And so this is not some hypothetical scenario. This actually does mimic what is happening in the real world. In Southern California, in this intertidal zone, these rocks are constantly being turned over, therefore exposing substrate, exposing a rock surface that wasn't previously ideal for these photosynthesizers. Yeah.
Does it ever occur that the pioneer species drives away basically unsuccessful attempts of colonizing species?
Absolutely. Your book actually has an entire section on kind of these three different methods, different ideas about succession, and one of them is these guys are essentially making it much harder for these guys. Yeah, so it all depends on the situation. Yeah, it all depends, but definitely does happen. All right, so generally, what is initiating succession, that is this sequential development of communities, is a disturbance. Right, any thoughts on what a disturbance could be? What types of changes? Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts? Okay. So something is affecting the environment. The living creatures are being affected. What do you think? Any examples?
Climate change.
Climate change. Was that your answer?
No, introduction of an invasive species.
Yeah, absolutely. So invasive species, that's definitely a disturbance.
Natural disasters.
Natural disasters, that is a huge disturbance for sure.
Acidification due to the fact that can change the chemistry of the sediment.
Absolutely, yeah. So this physical change, so acidification of soil, acidification of water. I think I heard deforestation. Great, yeah, that's a huge habitat shift. Awesome, yes. So big disturbance, an asteroid hits. Right, so an Armageddon kind of situation here. That is obviously going to disturb the living community. Much more common, a volcano erupts. Right, so in this case, there is actually new substrate. Right, there wasn't an island here before, but now that the a volcano has erupted to a certain extent. Now there's new land emerging out of the water, and it doesn't have a community yet, right? So this can, of course, develop a community over time. Okay. Forest fires, deforestation, very much disturbing the current community. Even something as small as a tree falling down. So here we can see that a tree has been cut down, but similarly, if a tree falls down naturally, essentially the environmental conditions on the forest floor are now completely different in this essentially large sun fleck, right? Than they are surrounding it, right? Different amounts of light, different variation in temperature over the day, right? This gap in the canopy is called a tree fall gap, and it is essentially a disturbance that is going to promote succession. And so in any of these situations, right, whether it's something as large as an asteroid or a volcano, or something as small as a tree falling in the forest, whether or not it makes a noise, right, it leaves an impact on the community. There is a predictable sequence of communities that are going to develop in the same place over time. And so what we can see here is the initial exposed rock, right? So maybe after a volcano has erupted or something, note that this rock is in each of these images. So we're not looking over space, we're looking over time. Initially, this rock is going to be colonized by lichens, by mosses. These guys aren't too picky about where they live. Soon enough, grasses, herbaceous plants, maybe tiny seedlings are going to take root. And then a forest community can take root of particular species, but these ones are outcompeted eventually by yet another community of forest trees. And so these steps in the development of the community, in this succession, these are called seral stages. So this is a seral stage, and this is a seral stage, and this is a seral stage, and each one has a pretty predictable composition of species. Okay. Together, this entire timeline, however long it's going to take, right? Usually this is years, sometimes decades or centuries, depending on what type of environment we're looking at. This entire timeline is called a seer. And so the sequence of communities, which is comprised of multiple seral stages. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, very good. The end all be all here, right, is the climax community. Okay? And so this is the most mature forest. Generally, this is not permanent. There's always kind of minor disturbances. So essentially, when this tree falls or is cut down, that is going to kind of rewind the clock or revert to an earlier seral stage. Okay, so one of these trees is cut down. There's a tree fall gap, and so now there's a lot of competition by these smaller plants, and so in that tiny space, you're going to have this community and then this community. So it kind of rewinds the clock here. Oh, sorry, too fast.
Sorry for this.
Oh, it's all good. The disturbances we've talked about so far are kind of covering a wide range of severity, right? A tree fall gap, right, really small, and generally there is still a community that already exists down here, right? So it just has to grow. It doesn't have to like make soil or actually change the physical structures of this environment. On the other hand, when a volcano erupts, that is completely changing the environment. It is covering over any community that used to be there, if any. And so there is a lot more that has to happen. So we can divide succession into two main types, depending on the severity of the disturbance. Go to the slide. The first type of succession is what happens after there's a really severe disturbance. So primary succession, essentially going back to the basics. In primary succession, this starts with a new environment. There is no existing community. For the most part, there's no existing soil. Okay? So remember that soil isn't just, these particles of rock. Instead, it also contains organic matter. It also contains living organisms. Okay? So after a volcano, there isn't any of that. Okay? Last year was particularly active as far as volcanic activity goes. This is one of the first ones from last year, and it just kept going from there, because we weren't dealing with anything else last year, right? So lots of new environments were created by volcanoes erupting last year and even into this year. When tectonic plates shift, okay, they often expose underlying material, which of course does not have organic material. It does not have living creatures within it. Okay, so this is a new substrate on which life can colonize, but it needs to go through these steps first. Okay. When glaciers melt, this is essentially exposing land that hasn't been able to see the light of day for a very long time. There is not actively living creatures within this soil. And so something like newly exposed land after a glacial melt is also going to undergo primary succession. Okay. Parking lots, right? They start off with no living material, right? Just bare substrate. But as we know, especially if they're not being driven over all the time, life finds a way. Right? So it always comes back to that. So you start to see cracks in the parking lot, and then little grass is going to pop up through there. Parking lots are undergoing primary succession. Yeah.
So by that logic, the same could work for a parking lot that's been like abandoned or hasn't been used. Because cracks are forming, microclimates form in there, lots of moss could form in there.
If you ever get a chance, and it's just kind of a silly thing, there's the parking lot behind the Shore Mall, which is in Pleasantville, and it has been abandoned for quite a while. They cut off an entire section, and it used to be just straight up pavement. It's now like a little grassland.
That's primary succession.
I was gonna say abandoned places, not only parking lots. For example, if there was no bus, towns or even houses in there, and it's incredible because I will always see like trees growing inside of the houses.
So cool. I mean, probably makes it more difficult for people, but life finds a way. So for all of these situations, right, houses or trees growing in houses, grass growing in parking lots, new forests growing where a volcano has erupted, essentially this requires seeds, right, to immigrate from other places and ultimately begin the long process of soil formation. Okay, so it takes a long time. So primary succession is just on a little bit of a different timeline than other minor disturbances. Okay, so this is approximately what's going to happen. Parking lot, lava, whatever, is bare inorganic rock. Okay. The very first things that are going to colonize are generally called pioneer species. This is kind of a blanket term. Sometimes this refers to species that colonize in secondary succession as well, but generally the first things that are going to come into a newly exposed environment are pioneer species. Okay. In general, lichens are able to colonize first. We can see them attaching to just bare rock. They don't need soil, they don't need anything else. Remember that this is a symbiotic relationship between a photosynthesizer and a decomposer. And so together they are able to live even without soil. Right? Everything else needs some kind of soil or to eat something that uses soil. Lichen does not. So generally lichens are the very first things that are going to enter into a new environment. Generally, when these ultimately die, they are going to provide organic matter that then breaks down into soil, okay? And the soil can then be used by other types of plants. Okay? often together with the lichen are mosses. Okay, so these are also really robust to stress. If you remember from D&E, these are the plants that colonize land first. Of course, there wasn't a lot of soil, there wasn't a lot of organic matter, and so these guys still retain those abilities. They can colonize the thinnest, crummiest of soil and ultimately build it up over time. Okay, again, they die, thickening the existing soil. And so what we can see here as we go through time is that the soil layer on top of, in this case, the bedrock, the soil is going to get thicker and thicker and thicker because of plant matter breaking down and donating its tissues to the growing layer of soil. This, essentially the life and ultimate decomposition of these organisms enables other types of species to colonize. In general, it's things like grasses that grow first. These guys are really versatile. They don't need a lot to grow. They can grow really fast. And they immediately can utilize the minimal soil that's been built up by these guys here. Does that make sense? Okay. So, good with this? Almost. Go on to the next one here in 3, 2. An example of this that might not seem so extreme, but is in fact kind of extreme, are sand dunes. Right, so all the time you have waves washing up new parent material. Right, so sand is essentially just broken down rock. It is inorganic substrate, and so it does not have an existing community on it. Okay, so as waves deposit sand onto a beach and windward slopes, right? So the wind is also creating these dunes. Essentially, the very first things that can colonize are grasses, right? So very quick growing, versatile species here. Essentially, their roots are going to stabilize the dunes, right? And in stabilizing those dunes, essentially other types of species, right? So more robust grass here, conifers, and ultimately hardwoods as well. So trees can ultimately grow because the dunes have been stabilized by beach grass here. Okay, the grasses, of course, are relatively quickly outcompeted by these other types of plants. Okay? And when I say quickly, I don't mean like weeks. Note, we're talking centuries here. This image is Sandy Hook. So I'm kind of off towards New York City there. What we can see is, dunes forming on this side. And because this land has been protected for so long, we don't have, people running all over the dunes and moving the dunes to build more houses and all that kind of good stuff. The trees have actually been able to colonize. So this land is actually going through these successional stages. Okay? And actually, this area in particular has the oldest American holly forest, I think in North America. And so that is one of the many types of trees that further stabilize these dunes. You guys been to Sandy Hook? Yeah.
Near there.
I know that.
It's worth it.
I know that there's like a school you gotta like do a thing for to get in for like high school.
Interesting.
That's it. Like, did you already send you up? I think there's like 2 of them. One year here called like, it was called, I think Kevin Delaney, usually went there. And there's also like Mates and Mass.
Yeah, they go there a lot. Yeah.
Well, isn't the beach on which all the famous shark attacks happen?
I don't think that's this one. I thought that was closer to here. Right, the Jaws shark
Yes,
attacks.
I did the
Yeah.
Jaws shark attack.
Yeah, I thought that
There's
was.
so many sharks around here. It's cold water.
Oh my-
Because of Chesapeake, all that stuff comes up from the water.
I
and
mean,
I like that.
it's not like bull sharks most of the time. It's mostly gonna be.
Like dogfish.
Because bull sharks are very aggressive. And that's what Billy Jaws is based on. So.
I think that's also there with some of the attacks that happen in New Jersey.
Yeah, specifically, yeah. Bull shark attacks, specifically New Jersey.
Yeah, no, we're good.
We're so intense.
Just kidding, New Jersey, more bad rap it doesn't deserve.
Oh. I don't know. Maybe everyone else is intimidated. We have sharks. We're okay with it.
And we've got forests.
And the Jersey Devil.
And the Jersey Devil, yes, don't forget. Protection for the Jersey
Scotland
Devil.
has Nessie, but okay. That's
Well,
cooler, in my opinion. Whatever. My opinion is
it's important. Also, new substrate is formed along rivers. So when rivers flow down a slope, right, in this case through the mountains here, along the way, the waters are eroding the banks. Right? So essentially they are picking up all of this parent material, eroding away the rocks, and carrying all that parent material farther downstream. When the river enters into the floodplain or into this larger open area, not through this channel here, essentially all of that parent material precipitates out of the water and is deposited in a couple different types of structures, but this one is pretty common. This is called an alluvial fan. Essentially when the waters are pretty high. And so during a wet season, the sediments can wash out across the entire floodplain here and deposit this material everywhere. And so again, this is pretty common structure to see in various environments. And essentially this parent material doesn't get colonized. Right? It doesn't have its own community. Of course, it might contain all sorts of nutrients. It contains different types of particulates, decomposing leaves and such. So it is delivering those types of nutrients, but it is still new material, right? It needs to be colonized. And so this would also undergo primary succession. Okay? We can call this soil alluvium, or we can call it alluvial soil. So both of those words are commonly used in this situation. If you look at the Mississippi River Valley, essentially, the river, right, isn't that wide, but in fact, because of the changing levels of the water, because of where it is flowing, right, through the Great Plains, right, lots and lots of organic matter, lots of very loose soil. All of that is picked up into the very muddy looking Mississippi. You guys seen the Mississippi before? It's pretty brown, right? So lots and lots of sediment is suspended within the Mississippi River. When it floods, it can deposit this sediment out into the valley. And so you might imagine that the valley is incredibly fertile because all of that, rich soil from farther upstream is deposited on either side. That makes sense? Yeah, so lots of nice, rich material to grow a new community. Glaciers. As I mentioned before, when glaciers recede, it kind of opens up this new environment for colonization by different types of plants and their subsequent animals. In addition to that, however, when snow falls, it is essentially compacted into the glacier. Right? So the glacier kind of moves a little bit in this compaction process and it kind of glides over the surface of the land a little bit. In the process, this is the real term, it is plucking up substrate from underneath it. Right? This is inorganic, for the most part, inorganic. So lots of rocks, lots of silt, and that substrate is displaced in a couple different ways. First of all, when the glacier recedes, whatever was trapped up within that ice is just dropped wherever it is. Right? So if you go a little farther north and you're just hiking through the woods and you see normal granite, and then a random massive rock that looks like it has no reason to be there. That is glacial till, right? It was just dropped by the glacier. And of course, it is not colonized by anything yet. And so primary succession can begin. The other thing is outwash. So as we can see here, at the base of this glacier, there's a lot of extra material, right, that isn't colonized yet. We can see the clear forest, and then we can see this outwash plain. Okay, so essentially, as the glacier melts seasonally, usually, anything that is trapped within that ice can be washed away, right? And then it is deposited on the land below. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's look at how communities change over time adjacent to a receding glacier. Okay, so this example is from Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Scientists have been recording the recession since the 1700s, so a lot of data. Also, they have been recording community composition for about that long. So what we can see here is this outline is the American part of the glacier, right? So this is Canada. This is the Alaskan part of the glacier. All of the colors combined are the extent of what the glacier was in the 1760s. Okay. Over time, of course, this has been melting, it has been receding. And so the first pieces of ice to melt are these here in light green. Okay, so that kind of disappeared first. Therefore, that soil has been exposed the longest. Okay. Next was, see this darker blue in here, right? So little tiny pieces of the glacier were still maintained, or actually, no, sorry, this one. This part was next, right? And then, these little patches, and all that remains today is that right there, right? I bring this up because these different places surrounding the glacier have been exposed, right? Exposed to the world, not covered by ice anymore for varying amounts of time. All of the data combined essentially gives us this picture here, right? At first, there's very little amount of vegetation that is able to colonize. The most abundant species are alders, okay, so they're kind of the pioneer species here. But then over time, as you move along through the decades, what we see is this shift in the community composition. Right? Spruce becomes very abundant next, after like 100, 150 years. And then finally, the hemlocks are going to become dominant, right? Ultimately outcompeting all of these pioneer species. Okay? And so the timeline here matters. Or let me draw your attention back to this timeline, because, for example, this portion here has been exposed for the longest, right? For a couple hundred years now. It has a different community. So it has the spruce and hemlock community here because it has been exposed the longest, right? So what this landscape is showing us is that there is actually a mosaic of different communities based on how long they have been proceeding through those several stages. Okay. So this is called a chronosequence or a chronosphere, depending on what source you're looking at. So yes, this landscape is undergoing succession, but not all at the same time. All of these different places are at different stages along that sphere. That makes sense? Okay. Of course, as always, we talk about the plant community because the plant community is what gives this structure to the environment. But we also know that there are animals that come along with those different types of plants. This data is from the same study. So the same paper here. What we can see is brown bears and black bears. Okay. In general, brown bears look like they are perfectly comfortable in recently glaciated areas, right? So where the glacier has just receded, and there might be a community of alders and willows and other quickly growing plants, right? Brown bears, completely happy there. But black bears require a young forest, so maybe here, or an older forest, so the pure hemlock and spruce. Okay, so different animals, as we were talking about before class started, the different animals have different requirements. Okay, so they are also included in this succession, but generally we talk about these communities in terms of the vegetation, like we've seen before. Any questions about primary succession? No. All right. Secondary. This is essentially progression through these different community stages, these different several stages, after a smaller disturbance. Okay, so something like a fire seems very intense, but really there's still a community intact. Okay, so after a fire, secondary succession could proceed. Things like floods or hurricanes, anything that does not completely wipe out the community down to bare rock. Because there is some kind of community structure, there might be a seed bed still present, and of course there's still soil, the recovery is a lot faster. So instead of looking in terms of hundreds of years like here it might be decades or maybe up to 150. So much faster. Just kidding. So I'm going to give you two different examples. One is in New England, and the other, I'm going to talk about the pine barrens and talk about succession here. So to start with New England, essentially, initial colonists cleared vast tracts of land, trying to initiate a strong agricultural presence. Right? So lots and lots of land cleared in places like New Hampshire and Vermont and Massachusetts. Over time, people realized that, oh my gosh, the soil is full of rocks. It is a pain to do anything with agriculturally. And so they tried cattle, right? That was also kind of a pain. So ultimately, within the last century, most of New Hampshire has been allowed to just go back to the wild and allowed for more trees to return. And of course, that actually brings New England quite a lot of money. Like people drive along by these pretty trees. Good to go. So in this image, we can see this image is from 1940s or so. This is the same area like 10 years ago. Okay, so again, life finds a way. The forest will return even after it has been mowed and grazed and tilled up year after year. So let's break this down a little bit more. Yeah.
I think maybe we should have a poster with Michael saying that we're here.
Like we'll find a way. Michael,
You can see some of the same geographic features along the top.
yeah,
Although it's not exactly the same
like here.
frame. Yeah, like that hill in the center is on the end.
Yeah.
I can kind of see.
Yeah, so more or less the same environment, but incredible transition within only a few decades. And of course, when you're hiking through New Hampshire and everything, you can still see all of these old fences. They just let everything grow up. You can actually figure out what used to be there long ago. Right, initially, settlers tilled the soil, right, realized that was a terrible idea, started letting it go back to what it once was, like, yep, I'm done with this. And so initially, what colonized this space, right, which already had soil, right, not fantastic soil, but soil nevertheless, it had a seed bed, right, it had forests kind of surrounding it, and therefore seeds could come in from the sides, right? And so the first plants that would colonize are things like grasses and wildflowers, think like weedy things, and lots of weedy stuff. Okay? From there, plants like white pines and poplars, also hemlocks start to grow. And finally, once there is a nice canopy, essentially the environment has changed. There's a lot of shade. The temperature is going to be pretty consistent over the course of the day because the canopy kind of acts like a nice insulating layer, right? Instead of, super hot in the middle of the day and super cold at night, the forest kind of buffers that temperature shift, allowing other species that are a little bit more delicate at first, things like beech and maple, to grow up in the understory and ultimately take over the entire canopy. So here we can see the different seral stages of the New England community. Okay. When you are walking around the woods in New England, you can see kind of this transition, right? So these are hemlocks, right? They're kind of a mid-succession species. It's nice and dark, damp, and lovely. And in the understory, here we can see things like maple and beech that are growing up. So these are ultimately going to be the climax community, but they can only really take hold in the understory of these mid-successional plants. Okay, does that make sense? Cool. So long ago, we talked about shade tolerance. We talked about different plant attributes that would make them really good in different types of environment. So given what we know, let's think about the difference between early successional species versus later successional species. And I'm going to try to write on the board here. If you are an early successional plant, what kind of dispersal do you think you should have? Right? Do you think you should have a few big seeds or lots of little seeds? Yeah, lots of little seeds. That makes sense. So, and I'm going to try to write on the screen here so I don't have to roll up the board a million times. So you have lots of seeds and they should be pretty little, right? As opposed to maybe fewer seeds, right? But they might be pretty big, right? And so maybe big seeds have kind of a bigger lunch pack from mom, right? So parent plant packs a lot more material for the developing offspring, right? So these are more robust, but they don't really get distributed very far, very fast. Okay. Anything else about dispersal colonization? Anything else that might benefit in early successional species? Okay, so that works. How about growth rate? Should early successional species grow really fast or really slow?
Sean's grow really fast considering every other early successional species is also going to send out lots of little seeds.
Yeah,
So
oh my gosh.
it's the land grab. It's everybody rushing to get to their spot.
Manifest destiny right here.
Like those, it's like when people back in the day when they sold tickets to an Elvis concert, everybody ran to their seats.
Yeah.
And that's when they started instituting ticketed seating because people got trampled.
Oh, geez.
It seems like that problem hasn't been fully solved given recent events. Oh,
Oh, and also
Certainly has
Endgame,
not.
what's that?
and also Endgame, and the movie stands.
Absolutely, yes. These do. Later successional species, do they have to grow fast?
No, they are growing more slowly.
Yeah. So they have the time, right? They don't need to compete so quickly. So we'll just say slower.
So and they're just chilling. They're just
They're
taking it
just
easy.
chilling. All right. How about shade tolerance? Right, really going back there. Are early successional species tolerant of being in the shade?
Intolerant.
Intolerant, yeah. So they're intolerant. They need lots of sun. Yeah. Lots and lots of sun. And that ultimately allows them to grow fast, right? They need lots of sun, lots of energy in order to grow this quickly.
So what I'm getting is early successional species are burning the candle at both ends.
They are. And I think the next one here shows that they kind of taper out pretty quickly though, right? They're shade tolerant, they can grow in the shade. Size. You think these early ones should be big or small?
Small.
Yeah, right, they're growing super fast, right? Just pretty much trying to set up their little spot in the world, but they don't really get very big, right? They kind of tap out pretty small. Later successional species?
Much.
Yeah,
We have,
like huge trees.
let's see, there's the oldest tree in the world. I can't remember.
The big tree over there,
Think in General Sherman?
yes, and the general Sherman.
Is it?
I think that's the biggest one, but maybe not the oldest one.
Okay, I was wondering what the oldest one, I believe, is around 2,000 years old. Something.
And I think it's a bristlecone pine, which is
Yes.
even more impressive. Speaking of old,
There.
there it is. They grow really fast. They can't handle being shaded out by others. They stay relatively small. So do they live a long time or not?
No.
No, so they have a pretty short lifespan. I'm going to say that these are for the most part annuals. Right? If you have a garden, that's an A. There we go. You know that these plants have to be replanted every year, so they're actually reseeding themselves with all of those lots of little seeds, oftentimes wind dispersed seeds every single year. And so they don't come back again and again, they have to reestablish. Right, so if these are annuals, you might imagine these are perennials. Structure. Do early successional species have time to build up lignin, to build up this really strong, robust trunk? No. So these are herbaceous plants for the most part, right? There's always exceptions, but these are herbaceous. Okay. So things like grasses, things like wildflowers, as opposed to like trees, right? These are woody. So woody, they invest a lot of energy into strength. Okay, so they're building a trunk, they're building really strong branches. These things take time. Okay? So they're slow growing, but I guess the summary here is these go for quality over quantity, and these go for quantity over quality. That makes sense? Yeah.
Something that I think that the oldest plant I never recorded was actually an algae found in the Mediterranean.
Really?
Yes.
Didn't know that. That's cool. Love it. Your book gives a few more details. Essentially this chart here is contrasting the different physiological characteristics that make plants kind of really good at colonizing early or kind of taking their time. Okay, so just to highlight a couple things here, early successional plants, those seeds, yes, are abundant. They are mostly small. They're often dispersed by the wind, but also they are actually triggered to germinate, to sprout by a lot of light, right? They like a lot of light. They need a lot of light. So there might be a lot of these seeds, right, in the leaf litter, but if it is dark, right, so if there is a mature forest over them, the seeds are dormant. But as soon as the canopy is taken away because of tree falls, because of deforestation, because of forest fires, essentially those seeds are immediately going to germinate. Okay. Also fluctuating temperatures. Remember that the forest kind of insulates the forest floor. And so if all of a sudden it's really, really hot on the ground because there's no canopy offering shade, those seeds are going to germinate. Again, this shade tolerance concept from way back when, these early successional plants aren't very good in the shade as opposed to the late successional plants. But on the other hand, when there is a lot of light, they can photosynthesize a lot. Finally, I want to point out that the early successional plants are really good at acclimating to whatever the conditions are. So, you know, fluctuating temperatures, lots and lots of light, forest fires, right, of course, are really damaging, but early successional plants can do it. They can acclimate pretty quickly. These ones really don't. Okay. Also, there are often pretty limited resources in these disturbed environments. And so early successional plants are really good at snatching up anything that is actually available. And so I mentioned this earlier, but your book proposes that there are three kind of different models for how succession can progress. And the one that seems to be most applicable to eastern forests like those in New England is the facilitation model. Essentially, these early successional plants are really good at colonizing first, and they are going to physically change the environment, enabling or facilitating, as the model or as the name says, these late successional plants to grow. Okay, so as we can see here, like I pointed out, the hemlocks, they are relatively early successional or mid-successional plants, and they really like a lot of light. Okay, they don't grow well in the shade, but they are great at producing shade. And so again, when you walk through a hemlock forest, it is very dark, which is what these late successional plants need in order to establish. Right? Ultimately, they're going to become part of the canopy, but when they're young, they need a lot of protection. Right? So it is physically the early successional plants that change the physical characteristics of the environment that facilitate the later successional plants to grow. Sense? Yeah.
Would that be an example of commensalism?
As a community, absolutely. Yeah, great connection there. Never really thought about it that way. A lot of times when you're talking about communities, we can generally talk about a community like as an organism itself. It changes, it develops just like an organism would. Yeah.
Because of the contrast between later successional organisms and early successional, because early ones just kind of are fast and rapid with how they accumulate resources.
Yeah.
Are most invasive species early successional creatures or early successional organisms, I should say?
Exactly. Yeah. So that is a great connection. They are really versatile. They can live pretty much anywhere. They grow really fast, right? Disturbance actually stimulates them instead of inhibits them like the later successional ones. Yeah. So they're just making a living, right? But we wish they would do it somewhere else. Great connections, guys.
Every plant is making a living.
Yeah, I mean that's all this is really. It's just inconvenient for the rest of us, the rest of the community here. Seems like we need to take 5, and then we'll talk about the pine barrens. Okay, so 9:40.
Yeah, it does. I was traveling to New Jersey.
Yeah.
On my way back, it was just me thinking of it was the same song that we were going to Georgia. Is that the song?
Of course I do.
So I was thinking of this. Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh, it's the Jersey that was going on to Georgia. Oh, that's fantastic.
Thank you.
You are so good.
Oh my God, he's so good, but thank you.
And the skull, it's so detailed. I love it.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. So good. Oh my gosh.
Thank you.
Word off earlier, still have to do schedule. So.
Good Thanksgiving. Oh no. So sorry. Oh, that's not the response I was looking for. Right. Well, I hope it is swift so it doesn't affect the last 2 weeks of class, the finals and all of that.
Yeah, so sorry for
Yeah, I think by that
I
time.
feel like there's gonna be a lot of that, so we all just mixed all our air. Well,
And then I think from sleeping a lot.
oh,
So then
no.
when I was trying to do it, because I have like assignments for a lot of my classes
Oh,
over, and I'm
of
like
course, so neat.
trying to like figure things out, and I'm like, even when it went to the doctor, I had to have my dad tell me what the date was, like, every time.
Oh,
Like I was
no.
out of it, I was just
Just
running
get
my
so
views.
foggy.
Yeah.
Oh.
the vendor we saw.
Oh, so much.
Like, I know that sleep will help me heal, but, you know,
Yeah, they're close to it.
oh, rough.
I love it. That's amazing.
I've been here for a while.
Oh my god. Just got job, but they did, I was gonna come back from New York. I was listening to the song because I always down to Jordan. And I was like, how much? What he was the gift that was. How are you doing? Are you okay?
Yeah, no, sorry, I'm sorry, I was just reading something.
But yeah.
Well,
what do you think of
apparently after class, I'm going straight home because apparently my one course is virtual tonight.
Oh, that's really
I hope that's not for a bad reason.
well, hope not, hopefully
geez.
not. But maybe because maybe some professors are busy, or maybe there was an emergency.
Well, there's Professor Corson, so it might be that he's finally has foster child or something, which would be wonderful. I wish him the best because he's and his wife have been looking into that for a while, and they're going through all the paperwork. And if that's the case, I'm gonna wish him the best. If it's not, I hope he's feeling all right. You know, he's awesome. He's just a friendly person. If you ever meet Professor Corson, or actually I should say Dr. Corson, he is a doctor, and Dr. Professor, Dr. Professor Corson.
Yeah, there you go. All of the titles and then out
He-
letters.
He's in the School of Education. Between him, Professor Tolino, and Dr. White, they're some of my favorite people here. They're just awesome.
I'm so, I have a question. Is it your anthropology professor? Is it your anthropology
Oh,
professor?
no, it's my education professor. So he's also one of my advisors.
Wow.
Yeah, no, he's cool.
Oh my god, I can't believe that they should be an advisor along with having a kid.
Sorry, no, it's okay.
Let's talk about the Pine Barrens, guys. It has been 5 minutes. All right, so the Pine Barrens, we've talked about a lot at this point. Let's talk about their succession. There's a lot of different ways that the Pine Barrens, of course, are disturbed. We've talked about a lot of them. Of course, we talked about clear cutting, building textile plants on like thread, all that kind of good stuff, right? Again, hypothetical scenario. Agriculture, timber, and fire, of course, is a major disturbance that we're going to talk about. So lots of different ways that the Pine Barrens are disturbed. There are different pioneer species. Of course, grasses really are the first ones that take hold again after a disturbance. In parking lots, in the forest, everywhere, grasses are often first in secondary succession. The shrubs or trees that take hold next are two different species. The eastern red cedar, which is actually a misnomer, it's actually juniper, but the common name is eastern red cedar. These are these like fluffy brownish green plants that you see all over the place around here. They are great at providing cover for birds, right, small mammals. They provide a a valuable food source for birds and small mammals. Right? So essentially they are attracting animals out into a recently disturbed area. Right? And of course we know that animals are great seed dispersers, so they can not only disperse the seeds of the eastern red cedar, but also anything else that the animals have recently eaten. And so this is kind of a clever way of attracting animals to repopulate the area. So eastern red cedars, characteristic pioneer species, will not grow in the shade. I tried. I was young and foolish. They do not grow in the forest. I wanted to save them. Pitch pine, the other one, right, which we know all about. We hugged a bunch a few months ago now. Pitch pines are also pioneer species, right? So they are going to grow in open areas, generally after completely clearing the land via fire, via development via timber, right? So both of these grow fast, they need a lot of light, they don't handle shade very well. Okay, so beginning of quarantine last year, I made a video about succession in South Jersey. It is the very first thing I ever edited, so I'm going to talk over it because the audio is not something I am proud of. I've come a long way since then, but it's a moment in time. So I want to show you the different stages of succession within South Jersey. Hopefully, I think it's muted down here. Okay. So in your notes, you have this diagram right here. Essentially, we see this linear progression of succession. Immediately after a disturbance, you see grasses, you see eastern red cedar, and you see pitch pine. Okay? If you leave the area alone, that is, there are no more disturbances, the area will grow more, right? So what we are seeing here is a field that has been mowed within a year and a half to 2 years before this video was taken. We can see the grasses that have started to populate. Oh, no, not yet.
I know that, but
Yeah. Like, this is what I was
That's
doing
on
in
my way
quarantine. And the characteristic fluffy eastern red cedars. You can see in the background the more mature forest of what used to be here, decades and decades ago. All right, so very clearly a recently disturbed field. And so the next place that I'm going to show you is pretty much right across from the movie theater, right next to that new Starbucks. Essentially, what happened a few years ago, oh my gosh, maybe like 10 years or so at this point, the entire area was clear cut. It did look like this over here, but it was cut down and then nothing ever happened with it, right? They didn't build right away. And so what we can see now after all of that time is these here are Pinus rigida, they are pitch pines. Lots of grasses, okay? And so that's what we can see now. Essentially, the way that all of those seeds got there, right, after the clear cutting, like the ground was completely bare afterwards, was on the perimeters, right, across Route 40, or I guess Route 322 right there. And as we're going to see, kind of like the housing development around this little plot of land, the seeds are going to blow into that land, right? And they are going to repopulate accordingly. Also, there are a lot of different types of animals that really like the open habitat that, unfortunately, this deforestation has created. So it's like essentially a savanna now, and certain things, not kangaroos in South Jersey, of course, but that would be wild. If I see kangaroos at Starbucks, I don't even know. But essentially, some animals really like the open savanna environment here, and so they can help to distribute these seeds. Note that there are different types of seed shapes, and that can enable particular types of plants to colonize out here in the essentially savanna more than others. And then, of course, as we know, once those trees are established, they change the environment down here, therefore enabling other species to come out into this habitat. And so what I'm showing here is this is the forest that used to be here, but animals can still live in this area. We can still see pitch pines. Okay, so here's a nice big pitch pine that can send its seeds over here. And so that is where the seeds are coming from, right? In addition to the seed bed, out to develop this community into the next seral stage. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, so actually maintaining these fragments of forest is a really good thing, right? So actually, animals, yeah, we love animals. All of these species are up here not just because they're adorable, but because these are all really important savanna species in the pine barrens, so including around here. Particularly grasshopper, sparrow, and red-headed woodpecker are threatened in New Jersey, not nationally, but threatened in New Jersey. Both of these really like to live in the forest, but then eat in the savanna. So they're always at this interface between the two of them. And so both of them are eating seeds and insects. Okay, and so they are going to bring those seeds and et cetera out to help repopulate the savanna. Eastern cottontails are also really common in savannas, like the two that we just saw. They don't really live in the forest quite a lot. There are a lot of predators in the forest, and so to stay away from them, they kind of hide out in the grasses where it's more dangerous for the predators, but they can easily hide. Similarly, quail used to be really common around here, not quite so much anymore, but essentially these guys only will live in the grassland, such as those early successional lands that we just saw. These guys are kind of wild. The grasses over time kind of like lay down and form these little hoops, and the quail will actually burrow under the little hoops. And so they have this whole little city right underneath the grasses that have been laid over. You never really see these guys, but they're there. All right, so here is one kind of burrowing down, like if you didn't know it was there, right, you might not ever even see it.
Oh, did my kid? It sounds like he's a horror movie.
Right. Oh yeah, so here, right, welcome to Stockton, right? Again, this is in quarantine, we weren't here at the time, but the reason I'm showing this is that for years, right, the entire corner there where that sign is kind of looked roughly like this, right? It was developing into later and later successional stages. At this point, right, it is at this point, the grounds crew mows this, right, which disturbs the land over and over and over again, and essentially is preventing this land from progressing to the next successional stage. And so we can see this stuff all over the place. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we have seen the early succession, the grasses with the fluffy little red cedars in there and some pitch pines growing in the two different places. If you don't disturb the land, essentially what's going to happen is the pine trees are growing to keep on growing. Okay, so we can see here, this is a beautiful stand of pitch pine. They're really dense, even though these were the pioneer species. Now they're in the canopy. Okay? For the most part, right, you're just seeing the pitch pines, but creeping in the understory are trees that look very different, of course. So these with the brown leaves are oaks. Okay, so that is beginning the next stage of succession, the next seral stage. Makes sense? You can see all the different tree types.
Trees out there are so nice.
Right?
There's so many.
Our parking lots, right? Remember when they were so bare? So what I'm pointing out here is that we can kind of get an idea about what the forest looked like before there was a parking lot here. We can again see this nice, beautiful stand of pitch pine all in the canopy, right? So this was kind of mid-successional or later in the Pine Barrens. And in the understory, apparently I talked faster in the video. In the understory, we're starting to see oaks, right? So this is, these trees aren't that old, right? So they probably started growing, maybe after the parking lots were built. And so if we just let these little strips go, eventually the oaks will take over the pines and there'll be strips of oak trees instead of pine trees. And so that leads me to here. In mid-succession, the pitch pine is in the canopy, but oak trees, and to a lesser extent some other hardwoods, they are going to be growing up in the shade. Now, the Pine Barrens is a really unique environment in that it is maintained by disturbance. It needs to have disturbance, specifically fire, in order to maintain this nice pitch pine forest. If there is no disturbance, succession is going to continue, and ultimately the oaks are going to displace the pitch pines, right? Ultimately. There's also some other plants like mountain laurel and blueberry, which we measured when we were out in the field. Right, so this is on view of King Ferris. Here we can see this later successional forest, meaning that this area has not been disturbed in a really long time. Okay, this lighter bark, these are oak trees. The darker bark are pine trees. So we can see this transition. Also, the green fluffy that just went down there, those are mountain laurels. Okay, so those are only really popping up when succession has been allowed to progress to a large extent, right? So this has not been disturbed for quite a long time. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so without fire, without any kind of disturbance, mountain laurels show up, oaks start to displace the pines. So disturbance can be a lot of different things. So not just fire, right? But also things like mowing, okay, like we saw out by the sign on Jim Lee's Road. Okay, what we can see here is a continually disturbed area, so grass, 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 next to where the mower stops. Okay, so you can see the contrast between the succession and the disturbance. This is at the end of Jim Lee's Road. There is a CVS there now, but this field like 20 years ago or so was a pumpkin farm. And so tilling every year, mowing every year, it kept this at the initial early succession forest. Over time, those, once the pumpkin farm closed, how fast I was talking before, but not. Sorry, guys. So the pumpkin farm ultimately closed down and the farm was allowed to grow. Okay, so 20 years of growth ultimately looks like this, right? We can see some of those nice fluffy eastern red cedars, but also we can see other hardwoods. Right? So these are more hardwoods that have grown in just a couple decades time. Right? So from flat bare earth to forests in like 2 decades. Here, they cleared the mid-successional forest to build a CVS, and now something else that they halfway built that stopped. And so we can see early versus mid-succession within the same field. So once again, we see this kind of mosaic of communities at different several stages, even within the same landscape. You can see this like driving all over the place. Another kind of disturbance is roads. Right? So here is, a mid to late successional forest, lots and lots of pine trees, some oaks mixed in. But then when we go back to the road, it's worked better in my head. When we go back to the road, what we can see is there's a lot more light along the road. Tires themselves, people themselves disperse seeds. Okay, so we maybe have dispersed the eastern red cedar seed. So along the road, this is more of an early succession, given this, as opposed to right next door in the denser forest. So lots of different examples around. So that's what happens if there is no fire, if there's no disturbance. Right? We can just keep on progressing through these seral stages. If there is fire, all right, and this is actually the natural condition in this area. Essentially, the predictable progression of seral stages is thrown off to an extent, right? And essentially, these plants are more adapted to disturbance. And so these ones and these ones very adapted to disturbance. And so those are ultimately going to take over and become the mature or climax forest. Okay, so I want to talk for just a moment about how pitch pines in particular are adapted to forest fire. So this frequent disturbance regime. Okay. So again, this is what I'm doing in quarantine. This is a pitch pine cone. Right. Blends in really well with the sand. This is an eastern white pine cone. Both of these pine trees can grow in the soil in the pine barrens. Right. So both are pretty good at living without a lot of nutrients. They're adapted to our climate. So both would be completely fine living within the pine barrens. Note, however, that the scales on the eastern white pine are wide open, but on the pitch pine, they're glued shut with resin. And so what's going on there, I will demonstrate here. This is a pitch pine cone, which I just put in the fire, and we can see in real time that the scales are opening up, right? Just in a few seconds like that. You can see this better. And you can take the scales and crumble them, right? Can open the pine cone up just with your hand. So after the fire, the scales are all opened up, exposing the seeds as opposed to being closed up before the fire. Okay. When we do the same thing with the eastern white pine cone, right in the fire for like 2 seconds, and what you're going to see is essentially a fiery inferno. This is not good at living in fire. Essentially, the seeds are being burnt right now, right? Those are no longer viable seeds. They have been burnt in the fire. And so just to drive this point home, here's another pitch pine cone. It's in the fire, in the fire, in the fire. So long it's not catching on fire, right? Just a teeny bit in just a second. But for the most part, it is resistant to catching on fire. And in fact, the fire itself is going to open up those scales and release the seeds out onto the ground. So again, here, now it's super dark, but the scales are being broken apart and essentially they can fly away with the wind. The seeds can germinate on the newly opened up soil, lots of light, lots of nutrients exposed from the fire.
Instead of roasting marshmallows, maybe we should roast pine cones
I
instead.
know. That's so cool.
They don't look very appealing.
Yeah, they're a little crunchy, but
They're interesting from a learning perspective, but they don't look like they taste.
ask a squirrel, I guess.
That's Twitter chalk right there.
Yes, you should wait, we should eat pine.
Technically, though, we can eat the resin.
Yeah, and like we eat pine nuts, right? That's a thing, but the scales are a little bit unpleasant. Apparently not as much as more than 2 kiwis.
Yes.
But-
Maybe if you're just roasting them up for ourselves for the environment, kind of like here, take this, and this is yours.
Yeah,
Spread
yeah.
the seeds.
Yes.
We could do that for sure. Actually, the last couple of minutes of this video are showing the different controlled burn sites on campus. Right, so we actually burn for a lot of different reasons, but one of which to open up these pine cones to distribute seeds. Right, so I want to point out that this is kind of an evolutionary trade-off between these two kind of strategies. The pitch pines, right? They are not damaged by the fire. In fact, they are helped along by the fire, right? Their germination is going to increase because of a fire. And so in an environment that has a lot of fire, right? A very quick disturbance regime, fires every 3 to 5 years or so. Pitch pines are the seeds that are going to survive, and they are going to be able to germinate really without any competition. Okay, so this is a great strategy if there is a lot of fire. On the other hand, if there isn't fire, so we suppress fires because we don't want to burn down our houses or anything, that's a very noble pursuit, but pitch pine cones can't then open up. Okay, and therefore they cannot colonize into the future. On the other hand, eastern white pine cones, they don't need fire, so they're great in an environment without fire, but if a forest fire does go through, these cannot reestablish, not without immigration from somewhere else. Okay, so it is a trade-off. Both strategies obviously work. We still have both of these species, but we see mostly this strategy called serotinous cones. It's in your notes. I know you can't really see it here, but serotinous cones make sense in an environment that is regularly disturbed by fire, not in other environments. That make sense? Cool. In the interest of time, I'm gonna keep going here. Quick note, and then we'll do a class assignment. The frequency of disturbance can change the diversity of a community. Okay, so what we can see here is, of course, time on the x-axis, population size of 3 different species. At each disturbance, we see that these 3 species are able to colonize. Another disturbance, they have to recolonize. Another disturbance, they have to recolonize. Okay, so if there is frequent enough disturbance, diversity never really gets very high. On the other hand, if the community is never disturbed, okay, so here we can see one disturbance way back when. The same 3 species can colonize. These are pioneer species maybe. And then the later successional species can colonize as they outcompete the pioneers. Okay, so once again, we end here with 3 species, hypothetically, and 2 species, really, so not that much diversity. And so there's kind of a sweet spot. Okay, so a medium level of disturbance. Okay, so here we have a disturbance. The 5 early and later species are going to colonize. Right? Before all of the pioneers completely die out, there is another disturbance event. And so we end here with 4 or 5 species as opposed to 3 or 2. Okay, so an intermediate level of disturbance really does produce the highest diversity. And so this is called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. If the goal is a lot of diversity, regular disturbance or patches of disturbance throughout the community, throughout the landscape, is the way to do it. And so that is actually going to be what we talk about a lot next Tuesday, this idea of patchiness and multiple disturbed environments and how they all work together to ultimately increase diversity. Does that make sense? So I know we are getting there on time. We have about 15 minutes left, which is perfect. What I would like to do today, as you guys are jotting those last couple notes down, is I am going to give out an abstract and part of an introduction and a couple tables or graphs from a study on Mount St. Helens. Okay.
I was thinking of that volcano earlier.
Of the same one?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. You guys just know what I'm gonna do before I do it.
I mean, everybody knows Mount St. Helens, so
Well, yeah, that's true. That's true.
most people, I should say.
If you don't,
I don't know
Mount
them
St.
personally.
Helens in Washington erupted, the big one, on May 18th, 1980. The force of the blast was able to topple the trees in the entire area, right? They kind of look like matchsticks. This is not fir, those are trees from up above. Also, of course, the ash and lava was able to cover the existing community. We can see some of the forest has been pushed down over here, but generally this is their substrate, right? No community is existing there for now. So absolutely devastating, but again, life finds a way. So these images are, again, approximately the same spot over 20 years. Well, actually, 24 years from the eruption. And so we can see that it changes over time. Here, just like a tiny little fluff of green. Over time, there's some shrubs, some herbaceous plants, and then finally, right, and this is even more developed now, we can see a pretty high level of diversity. The largest trees are right here along the road, right? So just like I said before, people bring seeds, right? We disperse seeds, and so that's probably what's happening there along the road. What type of succession is this? Primary or secondary? Primary, very good, because this